coming of these lanterns hung up in the Old North Church, one of by land, two of by sea. Beautiful, stirring, patriotic poem, also completely false. None of it's true. So first, let's start with the lanterns. In the poem, it talks about these lanterns that are hung up in the church as a signal to revere. They're not a signal to revere. They are likely put up at his request. That part is probably true. But they are actually a signal to people on the Massachusetts mainland. See, back then, Boston is just a peninsula, only connected to the mainland of Massachusetts by a very thin stretch of land, an isthmus we call the Boston Neck. Revere is afraid he would not be able to get off of the peninsula, and so he has lanterns hung up in the church so the people on the mainland would know what was going on. Next of the lanterns it says, one up by land, two up by sea, which is close, but not quite right. It was one up by land, that part's true, and it was two if by water, but not by sea. It's actually two if by the Charles River. But here's the thing, say you're Longfellow writing a poem, you quickly realize not that much great stuff rhymes with river, but everything rhymes with sea, so we went with sea instead. Next in the poem, it talks about Paul Revere riding through the Massachusetts countryside shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming," but Paul Revere never would have said, "The British are coming." Anyone know why?
Because the British it's a British colony.
Exactly, yeah, it's a British colony. We're all British. It would be like riding through the Massachusetts countryside today, shouting, "The Americans are coming, the Americans are coming." We're here, you don't have to yell. And also, probably not yelling either because he doesn't want to get caught. He's probably just going up to a building quietly, knocking on the door and saying something like the lobsters are coming, or the bloodybacks are coming, or the regulars are coming. Back then, when we said regulars, we meant enlisted men, and when we say regulars, we mean 2 coffees with cream and sugar. Finally, in this poem, it implies that Revere is the only rider out this night. Not true at all. There's actually many, many riders throughout the Massachusetts countryside warning of the oncoming advancement of the British Army. And in fact, from Boston alone, there are 2 riders. There's, of course, Revere, who actually does not get on a horse here in Boston. He actually gets on a rowboat here in Boston. He's rowed across the Charles River to where there's a horse already waiting for him. But there is a guy who does get on a horse here in Boston named William Dawes. Dawes gets on the horse here in Boston, takes it across the Boston Neck, that thin stretch of land that connects the peninsula to the mainland, and the 2 of them meet up later in Lexington, Massachusetts, a town outside of Boston, up and across the Charles River. Once they get to Lexington, they meet up with a 3rd rider. This 3rd rider is a young doctor by the name of Dr. Samuel Prescott. And he knows Revere and Dawes, because he had been involved with the Sons of Liberty in Lexington and Concord next door where he was from. But he'd not been planning on being a part of the ride. The only reason he becomes a part of the ride was just because they ran into him. Odd, though, that they should run into him, because this is the middle of the night, middle of the countryside, so it's odd that he's out so late. But the reason Dr. Samuel Prescott was out so late was he had just been kicked out of his new girlfriend's house by her father. And so when he runs into Revere and Dawes, what are you guys doing? Some kind of ride? Yeah, sure, whatever, I'm in. So successful shipper in his own right as well, specializing in one particular type of shipping, and that was smuggling. He was the best smuggler in Boston. Here in Boston, we love. I was leading one of these tours one time, and there's a kid on the tour, probably about 10 years old. When I got this part about Hancock being a smuggler, he gets really excited. And he says, "Smuggler? Like Han Solo?" I thought about it for a minute. I said, well, all right, Han Solo is a guy who operates a ship. Realizing by listening to me speak right now, which is that people in Boston cannot pronounce Apollos with Juan. So he changed his name, he anglicized it so it would be easier for us to say here in Boston, from Apollos with Juan to Paul Revere. Little did he realize we were going to pronounce that Revere. He then had a son. He gave his son that same name, and this is a monument to that famous son, Paul Revere, who, like his father, worked with metal, blacksmith, silversmith, coppersmith, goldsmith. He was a dentist. I mean, basically, Paul Revere would do anything for money. He had to. He had 16 children. He's the first person to come up with the idea of dental forensics, identifying a body by using dental records, and the first person to suggest burying people 6 feet underground, which is the way people are buried in many. It was a place for town meetings, and famously, this building was the site of the meeting. It was a Boston Tea Party, an event where 342 crates of tea were dumped off of 3 ships into Boston Harbor and purchased for the tax on that tea. And because this is where that building, where that meeting took place, this building was seen by the British Army as being a symbol of the Revolution. And so once the war began, we all left Boston, and the entire town became fortified by the British Army. Once they had the town fortified, they took all of the pews, all the seating out of the Old South Meeting House and burned them in a huge bonfire. Then used the Old South Meeting House as a place to store their horses. So as you can imagine, 10 months later, on March 17, 1776, when the siege of Boston ended and we returned to town, we had a lot of cleaning up to the Old South Meeting House, but it is much nicer today. You can barely smell the horse. But let's move on to our next stop. We'll meet you over at that crosswalk. Old state house, but it's had a lot of names, a lot of purposes over the years. It was a marketplace for many years. It was actually our city hall for longer than it was our state house, but we already have an old city hall, so we call it 1776, and we read the Declaration from that balcony almost every 4th of July to this day. But just to give you a little bit of an idea of what Boston was like before the Revolution, I'll set it up. This right here was where we had the seat of the royal government, the townhouse. Right over here where this Bank of America is today is where we had the seat of the Royal Military, the British barracks. And then this street right here, today it's called State Street. Back then it was called King Street. It ended once it reached that second to an enter sign down there. That's the end of the building across the street. That's Kilby Street. But at the time of the Revolution, that was the water line here in Boston. So everything from there forward is all land, the land that we reclaimed from the sea. But back then, it was the beginning of a wharf that we call Long Wharf. So Long Wharf started there, and it went about 1/3 of a mile into the harbor. So very accurately named wharf. It was very long. It was the longest wharf in Boston, the most deep water wharf in Boston. And so, as you can imagine, many of the goods that came into Boston came in from Long Wharf. And that is why we had right here the seat of the royal government, and right here the seat of the royal military overlooking those goods as they came into our town. But another thing that comes off of wharfs other than goods is sailors, and that is why on this corner we had a tavern. So one evening, this young fellow, his name is Edward Garrick, he's the young apprentice of the wig maker here in Boston. He's inside this tavern doing what you do in a tavern. He comes out and he sees one of the officers entering the building, Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch. Goldfinch had just had a wig made by Garrick's master, the wig maker. So when Garrick sees him, he starts shouting at him, "Hey Goldfinch, why don't you pay for your wig, you deadbeat?" Stuff like that. Goldfinch had already paid for his wig, so he ignores Garrick, he goes inside. Garrick also goes inside the tavern where he continues to imbibe. He comes out a bit later, this time with a group of his friends, and by this point, Goldfinch, the officer, he's not outside anymore, but there are just regular soldiers guarding the barracks. So Garrick and his pals, they start shouting at the soldiers, saying stuff like, "Hey, commanding officer, this is Debbie, why don't you pay for his wig?" Stuff like that, and soldiers, they ignore Garrick and his buddies, a bunch of drunks, but then Garrick and his pals start throwing snowballs at the soldiers, which they ignore. Then they start putting rocks in the snowballs, which the soldiers also ignore. Then they stop bothering with the snowballs and they start throwing rocks at these guys. Finally, one of these soldiers, Private Hugh White, has had enough. He crosses the street right up to Edward Garrick and smashes him in the face with the butt of his rifle. Garrick screams, he goes down. People start coming out of the buildings around here to see what all the commotion's about. A crowd begins to form around the soldiers, and as the crowd forms, the people in that crowd continue yelling, throwing stuff at the soldiers. Now, this goes on for a while before There used to be a church on the other side of the townhouse. Someone goes into the church and starts ringing the bell. But this is the middle of the night. Back then, only time a church bell would be rung in the middle of the night was if there were a fire. We took fire seriously. 90% of our buildings are wood. So you can understand, one building catches fire easily, entire town might burn to the ground. So once the bell starts ringing, everyone in the entire area within earshot of that bell, they start coming out of their buildings trying to figure out, what's going on? Is there a fire? What are we going to do about it? So by this point, the crowd surrounding the soldiers has grown huge. All these people surrounding these soldiers, shouting at them, throwing stuff at them. By this point, the commanding officer of the British barracks, Captain Preston, is out with the soldiers, and he is shouting, "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" as the angry mob shouts back at them, "Fire, you bloody lobsterbacks! Fire! Fire!" Meanwhile, everyone else in this entire area is walking around saying, "Is there a fire? Did someone say fire? I heard there was a fire." So maybe one of these soldiers thought they heard the order to fire, but for whatever reason, one of these soldiers does fire into the crowd. And once that first soldier fires, they all fire. At the end of it, 3 people are dead, 2 people are mortally wounded. They'll die from their injuries later. Another 11 people are injured. This, of course, is the event we refer to as the Boston Massacre. A man who made much of his fortune in the slave trade. But at the top of the building, there's a grasshopper. That grasshopper up there was made by a man named Shem Drown. Shem Drown built that grasshopper, put it atop the original Faneuil Hall in 1742. It sat up there for about 200 years before, as things will tend to after 200 years, it started to show some wear. It started to crack. And so we took it down to repair it. When we took it down, we looked into the crack of the grasshopper and realized the body was hollow. And inside stuffed full of colonial papers, money, and a note from Shem Drown that said, "So you found my secret." He made a colonial time capsule and hid it in plain sight atop Faneuil Hall for 200 years. Pretty cool. But there's just one final thing that I would like to point out to you before I end this tour of the Freedom Trail. And that is, do you recall when I had you look at our old Boston City Hall? Pretty good City Hall. Would you folks like to see our current Boston City Hall? Our current Boston City Hall is that. Yeah, now I should stress that this is not a parking garage or a prison which we later repurposed as our City Hall. No, we built it like this on purpose. It is an example of the brutalist style of architecture, and in 2006, our Boston City Hall was voted the ugliest building in the world, which, as you can imagine, here in Boston, we're very proud of our very ugly building. But folks, thanks so much for joining me on this tour of the Freedom Trail. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much, folks.
We're in Boston now, looking at downtown, kind of the common area.
Don't forget your hard work and bartenders, waitresses. Have a good day.
Going to a motherfucker like me, can you please remind me?
Hello. Are you started? Hi, me and Denise are in Boston. We just went on a walking tour. It was pretty cool. I enjoyed it. We saw a cool graveyard with John Adams was in there, and a couple other signers of the Declaration of Independence, and saw a few sites. It was cool though. I enjoyed it.
And we're at
Now we're at Bell Inn.
Young 80, 1795. It's the oldest tavern in Boston. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
It's really a cool little downtown. I shouldn't say little, it's huge. Boston's actually just a huge city, all kinds of things going on. We're going to have a few fish and chips and some Boston clam chowder.
Yeah.
So, anyway, we'll talk to you guys all later.
See the clouds and let them be. Keep every story of your days a mystery. Hear the songs in the breeze. Sing out. Light a flame inside your